This is not meth.
That's right, this is not meth. The compound featured in this video is a completely legal off-the-shelf cold medicine with relatively low abuse potential. YouTube, you have zero grounds to age restrict or demonetize this video, especially because this compound is nearly impossible for the average person to synthesize, and there is essentially no way to convert it into real meth. That said, it is pretty much identical to the real deal. To give you some context for why I'm doing this, I am something of a hobby chemist, and as such, I have naturally fantasized about preparing the Forbidden Rock candy. But since I'm not a terminal cancer patient with nothing left to lose, cooking actual meth isn't exactly something I plan on doing. I much prefer life outside of prison. So, to satisfy my compulsive urges, I recently decided to synthesize the closest legal approximation. This is hydromethamphetamine, otherwise known as propylhexedrine or Benzedrex. And to the untrained eye, it's pretty hard to discern from ordinary meth. The only real difference is the presence of a few extra hydrogen atoms, which convert this once powerful stimulant into a safe and legal decongestant that can be pulled off the shelf of any American Walmart. And since this stuff doesn't even count as a proper amphetamine analog, I can basically spend my whole day experimenting with it and not get into any serious legal trouble.
Patrick, you're not supposed to experiment with meth?
I'm not cooking meth. I'm making Benzedrex. There's no rule against that, is there?
No, guess there isn't.
FBI, open up!
This project technically started several months ago, when I was messing around on PubChem and randomly decided to look up methamphetamine, but with a cyclohexane ring instead of the usual benzene ring. This naturally led me to propylhexedrine, and upon realizing that it was a completely unrestricted substance, I decided that I simply had to make some. Unfortunately, there were only two established syntheses for this compound, and both were pretty much impossible for me to attempt. The first required cyclohexyl acetone, which is fairly difficult to obtain, and the second involved hydrogenating actual methamphetamine, which is obviously illegal to possess. So I set out in search of a new pathway, and after many sleepless nights of Google searching and Discord messaging other chemists, I eventually came up with the following route. As a starting material, I used the sodium cyclohexylpropionate that I had left over from processing pineapple perfume in a previous video. This was reacted with hydrochloric acid to yield cyclohexylpropionic acid, which I subsequently reduced to cyclohexylpropanol using lithium aluminum hydride. This all went fairly smoothly, and I actually got a pretty decent yield of the alcohol. But then, things started to go downhill. My plan was to dehydrate the alcohol to allylcyclohexane using sulfuric acid, react that with hydrobromic acid to get this intermediate molecule, and finally cook it all together with methylamine to get propylhexedrine. This was all based on an established route that is often used to make MDMA from saffrole, and honestly, it probably would have worked really well, if I hadn't used sulfuric acid to dehydrate the alcohol. You see, hot sulfuric acid is basically one of the most brutal reagents you can use to convert alcohols into terminal alkenes, and consequently, it annihilated pretty much everything I had. I only got a single milliliter of allylcyclohexane from this process, and while this did seem pretty useless, I pushed forward anyway to see if anything interesting would result. Long story short, I did get something, but it was really hard to say if it was actually propylhexedrine. The compound's hydrochloride salt could dissolve in water, and I was able to freebase out a tiny amount of oily liquid, but I just wasn't very confident in what I had after the messy sulfuric acid step. And plus, I was really hoping to get a measurable amount of propylhexedrine that could be crystallized in the traditional manner. So, I sat on the project for a few more months, researching the various synthetic pathways that existed. As an aside, it was actually somewhat difficult to find useful information on this chemical, partially due to its obscurity, and partially because the media has saturated the internet with stories about how dangerous it is to abuse. While the concerns here are valid, there is a lot of sensationalism surrounding drugs of this type. The news landscape in general is riddled with opinions and biases that twist the reputation of many useful substances, which is why I'm super excited to have Ground News as a sponsor. They are the world's first news comparison platform, founded by a former NASA engineer who wanted a more data-driven, objective way to stay informed. Available through app or website, they pull related news from their database of over 50,000 global sources and organize them in one place. Readers can even compare original research alongside how the media is covering it for a more comprehensive understanding of the world around us. Honestly, Ground News' mission aligns perfectly with my original intent for lab coats. to make information easy to find and put together concisely in one location. As an example, check out this article titled FDA Denies Approval for MDMA Therapy for PTSD. On the right, you can see under coverage details that 40 known sources are covering this topic, and thanks to the bias distribution, we know that 82% of the articles are center-leaning in terms of politics. Scrolling further, it is also possible to see that the articles are mostly factual, just the way I like it. The Ownership tab also provides useful insight from ground news about where your information is coming from, so you can judge its credibility and end up better informed. Quickly comparing individual headlines and assessing how they frame the issue is also super easy. For instance, this article by The Conversation is highly factual in its discussion of MDMA and the difficulties it faces as a possible PTSD medication, while this headline by Slate is more left-leaning and mostly theorizes about why the FDA has been reluctant to adopt this drug, emphasizing passion and calling the science shoddy. Go to ground.news/labcoats or scan the QR code to give it a try. If you sign up through my link, you'll get 50% off the Vantage plan, which is what I use to get unlimited access to all the features. By subscribing, you're accessing a better way to read the news, and you're also supporting my work directly. As usual, the links are down below. Alright, after spending some time researching how similar analogs are made, I eventually came up with a new and improved pathway, which, to me, seemed a lot more likely to work. It did, however, require the following rather lengthy assortment of ingredients: hydrochloric acid, cyclohexylamine, aluminum metal, tetrahydrofuran, lithium aluminum hydride, 68% nitric acid, sulfuric acid, salt, xylene, mercury, sodium hydroxide, 37% formaldehyde, dichloromethane, nitroethane, and finally, cyclohexane carboxaldehyde. Quite the list, eh? A big thanks goes out to Micah from Chemdelic for helping me obtain the nitroethane and aldehyde. He's an all-round great guy, and if you want to see how he produced the nitroethane, be sure to check out his channel, which I've linked below. To get things started, 33.5 grams of nitroethane was weighed out and added to a 250 milliliter boiling flask, along with 50 grams of cyclohexane carboxaldehyde. Upon mixing, nothing really happened, but this was to be expected. For a reaction to occur, a basic catalyst of some kind must be added. In my case, I utilized 9 milliliters of cyclohexylamine, which caused the solution to temporarily become cloudy. Based on some other accounts, cyclohexylamine acetate could be a more favorable catalyst, so it's possible that adding 16 milliliters of glacial acetic acid on top of all this might lead to better yields overall. Once all the ingredients were mixed in, the flask was placed in a hot water bath and a condenser was connected to the top. The temperature was then raised to 70 degrees Celsius and held there for 5 hours. The reaction that's taking place here is known as a Henry reaction, and essentially is just a fancy way of linking a nitroalkane with an aldehyde, which under these conditions yields a substitute nitropropene and water. Normally, this reaction would be run with benzaldehyde to yield phenyl 2-nitropropene, or P2NP, which undergoes reduction to form amphetamine. While not the most practical precursor, amphetamine can be further processed into methamphetamine, and this is how our pathway to propylhexedrine takes shape. With the benzaldehyde swapped with its cyclohexane analog, cyclohexyl 2-nitropropene becomes the major product, which can be reduced to norpropylhexedrine and finally methylated into propylhexedrine. Pretty sweet, right? As the Henry reaction progressed, the solution went from a light straw color to a deep cherry red, and at the same time, water began crashing out, indicating that the reaction was indeed pushing forward. Once the 5 hours had elapsed, the mixture was taken off heat and washed with an arbitrary amount of water to remove the amine catalyst. The reddish oil was kept and then placed on ice to crystallize. And this is where I experienced my first hiccup. You see, when done with benzaldehyde, the P2NP usually solidifies into a cake of lovely yellow crystals. However, with the cyclohexyl 2-nitropropene, or C2NP, this didn't really happen. I tried recrystallizing the liquid from various solvents, and even cooling it down to -40°C, but nothing ever solidified. Column chromatography might have been able to separate the C2NP, but seriously, doing a column with this much liquid would be a literal nightmare. And plus, I had no TLC plates or reference data to check, so I would basically have to guess which fraction the product was in. And unlike last time, I couldn't just taste it to find out. In the end, I basically just had to accept that my product was somewhere in the red oil and move on. So, for my next step towards becoming Walter White, I had to perform the main reduction, which would convert any C2NP that formed into norpropylhexedrine. Originally, I was planning to use aluminum amalgam, but according to some sources, this type of reduction requires fairly pure nitropropene to work. And that is definitely not pure. I needed something that could indiscriminately reduce whatever I had in solution, and for that, I went with lithium aluminum hydride. This stuff is stupidly expensive, surprisingly dangerous, and I had already used up a lot of it during my first propylhexadrine attempt. But it was really the only option that I knew wouldn't fail. So, to a 1 liter boiling flask, I added 200 milliliters of dry THF. Then, 22 grams of lithium aluminum hydride was carefully added over the course of several minutes. This ended up being fairly exothermic, so the flask was placed on ice to cool down. Once all the hydride had been painstakingly added, a condenser and addition funnel were set up, and the latter was charged with 19 grams of crude C2NP. Then, with strong stirring, the stopcock was carefully opened to its very minimum setting. As soon as the C2NP contacted the THF solution, a violent reaction occurred, and vapor began filling the apparatus. This was mostly hydrogen, but some flash-boiled norpropylhexadrine, ethylamine, and atomized salts were also present. Now, remember how I said lithium aluminum hydride couldn't fail? Well, I lied. Sort of. I actually used way too little solvent here, mostly because I didn't have a lot to start with, and consequently, the reaction ended up being far too violent. This almost certainly led to some of the product degrading and escaping with the hydrogen. Dissolving the C2NP in THF probably would have helped a lot with this issue, but hindsight is 20/20. Anyways, once all the C2NP had been added, the solution became very thick with insoluble lithium and aluminum salts. To fix this and isolate the norpropylhexadrine, I carefully neutralized the solution with a few hundred milliliters of cold water. This caused the THF to separate and float to the top, where it was decanted into another flask, boiled down, and diluted with water once again. At this point, I planned to distill off the remaining THF using the water to help buffer the temperature. The only issue was that I didn't know freebase norpropylhexadrine would carry over with the distillate. Fortunately, as with most of life's problems, this was readily overcome with a healthy dose of acid. By adding hydrochloric acid, I was essentially trapping all of the amines as their non-volatile hydrochloride salts, which could be safely boiled without carrying over. The white smoke seen here was actually composed of these salts, and it was a good sign that amines were present and that the reaction had been successful. The only issue was that the solution also took on an extremely dark coloration, which obviously had to be fixed. So, after boiling off the remaining THF, I allowed the solution to cool and then washed it twice with dichloromethane. To my delight, this actually did an excellent job pulling out the colored impurities, and the solution it left me with was almost completely colorless. Theoretically, this liquid should have contained all of my precious norpropylhexadrine, along with a bit of ethylamine from unreacted nitroethane being reduced. To be sure though, I had to freebase it. Now, it may not seem like it, but this was actually a pretty big make-or-break moment for this synthesis. If an insoluble liquid formed after adding aqueous sodium hydroxide, it would mean the norpropylhexadrine had most likely been created, and that I could move on to the final step. But if nothing separated, it would mean I would have to go back to the drawing board. Thankfully though, I did get a precipitate. It took a while to separate, but it did eventually turn into an oily liquid, with a very mild amine smell that reminded me of grass or plant material. This seems to be fairly common among similar analogs, with the usual comparison being geranium leaves, so this was a promising sign. The only problem I had was with my yield. If the 18.8 grams of C2NP had been pure, and the reduction had gone flawlessly, I would have gotten close to 18 grams of norpropylhexadrine. In reality though, I only obtained about 5 grams, which corresponds to a yield of roughly 28%. Not exactly a number I'm proud of, but I suppose things could have been a lot worse. Alright, at this point, I had over 90% of the propylhexadrine molecule complete, at least in terms of molecular mass. From what I could tell, I had successfully produced the legal version of regular amphetamine, and now all I had to do was convert it into the legal equivalent of methamphetamine. And, based on what I had read, this actually wouldn't be that hard to do. All I needed was a little bit of mercury and formaldehyde.
Hold up. Wait a minute.
Yeah, don't worry, there was no way I was ever going to test this stuff on myself. Aside from propylhexadrine being a relatively unpleasant drug to abuse, making it from norpropylhexadrine tends to be a very toxic process. Formaldehyde is one of the most notorious cancer-causing chemicals in existence, and the mercury salts that are used alongside it could easily cause irreversible neurotoxic effects. At best, the propylhexadrine would end up reasonably pure and only ruin my day. But at worst, it could easily ruin my life. The choice was pretty obvious. To clear up exactly why I needed such toxic ingredients, here's the pathway I decided to follow. Formaldehyde participates in a condensation reaction with the amine group on norpropylhexadrine to form this intermediate amine molecule, which can be reduced to a methylamine group using aluminum amalgam. This whole process is technically a type of reductive amination, and there are actually a bunch of different reducing agents that could be used instead of the amalgam. The three main ones I had access to were sodium borohydride, palladium on carbon with hydrogen, and of course lithium aluminum hydride. The issue was that these were all quite expensive, and my palladium catalyst seemed to be mostly poisoned by previous syntheses, rendering it useless until I could get around to cleaning it. While toxic, the amalgam was far cheaper, and much less flammable than the other options. To make it though, I first had to get my mercury into solution. To do this, I moved everything into a fume hood for ventilation, and added half a gram of liquid mercury to a round bottom flask. Then, on top of this, half a milliliter of concentrated nitric acid was shot in. This quickly began to attack the metal, converting it into water-soluble mercuric nitrate and reddish-brown nitrogen dioxide gas. As this was happening, roughly 10 milliliters of methanol was added to the norpropylhexadrine, followed by 2.5 milliliters of aqueous 37% formaldehyde. This seemed to cause a cloudy precipitate to form, but it quickly cleared up with a little stirring. By the time this was done, the mercury had completely dissolved, and the solution was diluted with water. Then, to kick things off, 9 grams of shredded aluminum foil was added, and the solution was gently swirled. Almost immediately, the aluminum began to darken and tarnish, and if you look closely, you can even see hydrogen evolving and puffing up the mixture. Since I had never tried this particular reaction before, this kind of caught me off guard, and I quickly poured in the formaldehyde mixture, hoping to catch the aluminum before the water reacted with it too significantly. This caused things to intensify pretty rapidly, and in my rush, I forgot to add a condenser to the top of the flask. While I did add it eventually, this mistake cost me a decent amount of my product, which was carried away with the hydrogen and alcohol vapor as the solution boiled. I was honestly pretty worried that I would recover nothing from this whole procedure, but that all changed after I washed and emptied the flask contents into a beaker. It's kinda hard to see, but there were actually small droplets of an oily liquid suspended on the water's surface, which could have only been propylhexadrine or unreacted norpropylhexadrine. Actually, it could have been a lot of different things, but let's just pretend the chemistry behaved itself perfectly up until this point. Any insoluble nitroethane or aldehyde would have been reduced to soluble ethylamine and cyclohexanol by the lithium aluminum hydride, along with the nitropropene, which was brightly colored, unlike our solution. So either this was an insoluble free-based amine compound, or I just found a really convoluted way to generate really clean tar. Now, the typical method for isolating amines like this is to dissolve the oil in a nonpolar solvent and then acidify the mixture to crush out the product as a salt. In my case, I washed the solution twice with xylene to collect the oil, and then set up a hydrogen chloride generator to perform the acidification. Saturated salt solution was loaded into the main flask of the generator, concentrated sulfuric acid was added to the addition funnel, and a hose was led into another flask with the xylene solution containing the oil. As soon as the sulfuric acid was dripped in, a whitish haze could be seen coming off the xylene. Again, this was a good indication that amines were present, and sure enough, the solution became cloudy with precipitate after just a few minutes. Unexpectedly though, the precipitate turned out to be a liquid after it was allowed to settle. Practically all amine hydrochlorides are solids at room temperature, so this was quite unusual. I figured that the hydrogen chloride had just carried over some water, but upon boiling the liquid down, all I had left was a sticky goo that kind of smelled grassy and amine-like. I tried everything to get this stuff solidified, including several solvent washings to remove impurities, but nothing seemed to work. In the end, my final yield was a soul-crushing 1 milliliter of uncrystallizable, gooey stuff. A far cry from the several grams of crystals that I had originally hoped for. And worst of all, I had no way of knowing if there was even propylhexadrine present. It's totally possible that this stuff was mostly my product, and that I was all being kept semi-solid and amorphous by a few specific impurities, but without an NMR or other form of analysis, I couldn't say for sure. The smell and fact that it could be free-based were basically the only things I had to work off of. For a while, I seriously considered scrapping this project. I'm fine posting my failures, but when things go this bad, I don't usually bother. In this case though, I had dumped so much time and money into the synthesis that I just couldn't bring myself to delete it from existence. And boy, am I glad that I didn't. After thinking about it for a while, I decided to try one final test to see if propylhexedrine was present. An over-the-counter drug test. The active methylamine group on propylhexedrine is identical to that of methamphetamine, meaning it can trip for meth on a basic test. Of course, this particular variety is made for analyzing urine, so to test my sample, I needed to make some fake urine. To do this, I diluted a single drop of the free-based oil in 50 milliliters of water, and then adjusted the pH with dilute solutions of hydrochloric acid and sodium bicarbonate. Optionally, I could have added a bunch of urea and other salts to better match the real deal, but that wouldn't have really affected the outcome of this type of test. So, I poured my homemade drug pee into a test cup, crossed my fingers, and peeled off the label. At first, I almost couldn't believe what I was seeing. The drug test was showing positive results for not only meth, but also PCP and MDMA. Both meth and MDMA are secondary amines with methyl groups like propylhexedrine, so this was exactly what I was hoping to see. What made me even happier though was the fact that the regular amphetamine test was negative, meaning all of the norpropylhexedrine had been successfully methylated to the final product. Obviously, there were no opioids, cannabinoids, or cocaine present, but the PCP positive was a bit strange. At first, I thought this might have been caused by the cyclohexane ring, which both molecules share, but that didn't really make much sense due to its highly unreactive nature. The usual molecules that trip for PCP, including Benadryl and ketamine, are usually tertiary amines, so it seems likely that excess formaldehyde overmethylated some of my product, yielding N-methylpropylhexedrine, which could be similar enough to fool the test. In an attempt to be totally sure of what I had, I tried mailing in the drug test to the address listed on the box. I was hoping that the lab would be able to tell me what specific drugs were present in my fake urine, but all I got back was confirmation that there wasn't any real meth or other illegal drugs present. At least now I have proof for the FBI agents watching that I didn't actually make anything illegal. Alright, I think that's just about everything I've got for this synthesis. In the future, I would like to try making propylhexedrine again using the much cleaner cyclohexyl acetone pathway, but that might not be for a while. The dream of a clean, crystalline product isn't dead, but it is taking a long nap. In the meantime, I have plenty of other projects to keep me busy. For example, I recently hit 100,000 subscribers, and to celebrate, I set out to make one of the most dangerous elements in existence, fluorine gas. Be sure to stay tuned for that video's release, in which I definitely do not die. As usual, a huge thanks goes out to all the existing LabCoats patrons. Without their help, I wouldn't be able to make cool videos like this. Seriously, there was no way I could have afforded all the reagents for this project. It was ridiculous. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll catch you next time. LabCoats out.